everybody hear me? Fantastic. It's really lovely to meet you all. My name's Phoebe O'Hara. I'm the Clean Power Lead at the Energy Transition Commission. We are a global coalition of members trying to show how and also work together to get to net zero by 2050. And it's great to see some members in the room, such as SSE, Octopus, and Shell as well. When I was trying to explain yesterday what my role was today to a friend who doesn't work in energy, I ended up saying that I'm going to the Glastonbury of PPAs. And so how I'm going to explain the next session is that we've got some headline acts, and then all those headlines are going to come together to form a band, and we're going to have a fireside chat. And I was chat-GPTing, JP, apologies for chat-GPTing, but a band that split off and had their own separate careers and came back together. So you guys can either be Cream, Police, Nirvana, or Bee Gees for this afternoon. But enough from me. I'm going to start with our first expert session, and I'm going to introduce James from Shoosmiths, who's going to be unpacking and explaining how we navigate legal risk with PPAs. Thanks, James.
Yes, so my name's James Wood-Robertson. I'm a partner and I co-head the energy and infrastructure sector here at Shoosmiths. I've been advising on corporate PPAs for well over 10 years now. Some of the first PPAs I worked on have long since expired, and I've done everything from relatively small scale private wire PPAs all the way through to a route to market power purchase agreements for 2.8 gigawatts capacity of offshore wind, and everything in between that. The team here at Shoosmiths, the PPA team, we work on lots of projects for generators, but we also work on about an equal number of projects for buyers as well. So it gives us a really rounded view of the market and expectations from a generator perspective and also from a buyer perspective. So I've presented on PPA issues a few times in the past, but I thought because it's Renewabl Day, and to follow on from Zana's great keynote presentation, what I would do is when looking at legal issues, which let's face it, even as a lawyer, it can be pretty dry, we try and look at it through a lens of how you deal with legal risks and big commercial issues in PPAs within a digitalized and standardized process. So when people think about PPAs and they think about negotiating PPAs, the question on the screen is the one that I've been asked countless numbers of times over coffees, beers, in negotiations themselves when negotiations are taking too long. Why haven't we just got a standard form of PPA that everyone can just use? So if so many people are asking me this question, apart from the thought, of course, as a solicitor, I've got a vested interest in making sure that we can still keep drafting PPAs. But if everyone is asking this and so many people are asking the question, then why hasn't it already been done? And obviously there have been attempts to do that. There was the EFET, the European Federation of Energy Traders, created a PPA, which is great. And I've used it a couple of times in Europe, and you fill in boxes and you cut it down to a PPA that can be entered into, and that's fine. But it's never caught on in the UK. It doesn't seem to be used at all, particularly for corporate PPAs. And I think most of that is the reality that most generators, when they're managing a portfolio, they have their own precedent documentation. They want to keep their precedent to be used across all of their projects, their portfolio, so it's easier to manage. And some of the big corporate buyers, if they've got multiple PPAs, they often want to use their own because for the same reason, they want to be able to manage contracts that they understand. So you've got busy generators with other priorities, they're delivering projects, and also no industry body who's really taking this up and picking up the mantle and saying, we'll produce this standardized PPA. So my conclusion really on standardization is it's a nice idea, but I really think that there's a very low chance that there is going to be a usable market-wide, or even, I hate to say from Renewabl's perspective, even a platform-wide a standardized form of PPA. So with those challenges of standardization, how on earth do we dovetail? How on earth do we move from the nirvana that Zana was talking about, which was everything's digitalized, everything's easy and efficient and streamlined, and it's data-led and data-driven? We run a great risk of going through this wonderfully efficient process and then having an efficient process at the end where everyone's managing data and understanding how the PPAs work and operating them really efficiently. And then we've got this clunky, draconian, traditional, stiffs sort of process in the middle where it just takes far too long. And to be honest, in many cases, even sitting around those tables, it just takes far too long. So the first point, make the process more efficient. My colleague Grace, I'm not going to steal her thunder, Grace Kendrick is going to be speaking to you this afternoon about that, just on that process, how you get from term sheet to signing really, really efficiently, and some tips and recommendations as to how to deal with that. The second point is limiting the negotiations. And I know this might seem a bit idealistic, but if we can limit the negotiations to only those issues that are really, really material. And the way you do that, I think, is you start with a good starting point. So I always say when I'm acting for generators or buyers who have their own PPA, start from a PPA that's fair and balanced. Don't start way over on one side, or you'll waste a whole load of time trying to negotiate back to the middle. And what you'll get in the end is probably, especially with experienced advisors, you're not going to gain much at all. Have sensible counterparties. Again, maybe a bit idealistic. You never know. And be remiss of me not to say experienced advisors help a lot as well. Help a lot. So the reality of the situation is you've got a range of generators with a range of different PPAs. They've got their own standard forms. Having reviewed numerous of those standard their precedent agreements and their documents, to be honest, when you know your way around a PPA, there's a lot of it that is almost standardized. It's pretty much standardized. It might not be in precise words, but definitely in principles. So there's actually, you're not looking at this agreement thinking, wow, it's hugely complex and there's loads of stuff we're going to be negotiating. You're probably only going to be negotiating a few points. And that's what I'm saying. Focus on those particular issues. But there are certain material issues. We've focused a lot on digitalization, everything happening through process. Some stuff still needs a human touch, still needs a bit of human attention. So what are those legal issues that need that attention? The first one on the point is structural differences. I hope Helen's not sweating now. I'm not going to steal your thunder, talk all about the differences between virtual and physical PPAs. That's coming next. But when you're deciding which option you're going to have for a corporate PPA, whether it's going to be virtual or whether it's going to be physical, there are some key differences. If you put the PPAs together, especially if you've got one generator with two different types of ways of contracting, they won't be dissimilar at all. The vast majority of the provisions will be the same, but some will be different. Settlement, obviously, the settlement mechanic in a virtual PPA will be different. And it's not just like you slot in a standard form settlement mechanic. That will change depending on certain conditions and certain considerations that you need to take into account. And also the indices might be different. If you've got a physical PPA, the sleeving obligations and the sleeving provisions can be quite complicated. They will need to be slotted in, and they just need to work. It's not particularly contentious. They just need to work. Options will depend on what you're sleeving. Sometimes most of the time, if you're dealing with clean energy, you're sleeving intermittent volumes. But with some of the challenges recently in the market around costs of sleeving intermittent volumes, there's many suppliers out there looking to sleeve and looking to supply and sleeve baseload volumes. As well, so that will depend. The mechanics will be different there. Who's the sleeving provider? And really, really importantly with sleeving providers, what flexibility have you got within a long-term PPA to be able to swap your sleeving arrangements if you're a customer? That's really, really important. And there's other considerations as well, particularly, obviously you think about credit support, which I'll come to in a second. Credit support on a physical PPA when payments are moving in one direction is one thing. On a virtual PPA, when you can have payments moving in two directions, depending on whether you're above or below the agreed strike price, then your credit support considerations are slightly different. So then moving on to credit support, huge issue on any PPA. It's something that needs to be put right to the front of any conversation. Is it needed on day one? And really importantly, is there an expectation that both parties are going to provide some form of credit support? If it's not needed on day one, when is it needed and when might it be needed? What financial threshold, what creditworthiness threshold would the company need to fall below that would trigger a situation where replacement or additional credit support needs to be put in place? And credit support is so important because it not only determines price and can impact price, it goes to the very heart and determines the deliverability and the bankability of the PPA itself. So going back to our digitalized process, if you're working on a digitalized process and you're agreeing a price, if you're using a digitalized platform or PPA platform, procurement platform, there need to be clear credit support assumptions or requirements, indeed, or possibly, and it might be a bit too stark, but some sort of vetting process to be able to get to a point where everyone participating is deemed creditworthy. Change in law is the next point, often an issue that people think, oh, lawyers will know all about change in law. I bet they love that one because it refers to law. I hate it. I hate change in law. Lawyers like certainty. We're a bit like investors, like certainty. Chris is scorning. Maybe Chris doesn't like certainty, but I don't like change in law. It's far too uncertain. The provisions are unnecessarily vague. We don't know what's coming down the line, so they just have to be vague. There will be the parties will seek to agree a rebalancing of the risk and reward in the contract. It talks like that, and that for me, that I think how on earth are you going to enforce that? So there's all sorts of issues around change in law. I like to borrow from Donald Rumsfeld when I talk about change in law, talking about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Unknown unknowns are things that you sort of write, well, something might happen in the future and goodness knows what that might be, but we're still entering into a 10-year contract and we just need to take that on the chin. The known unknowns, REMA, is the classic, is the one that spook people a bit. It's that thing you can see on the horizon, but you can't quite make out what it is. And that's the problem. You know it's there, you know it's going to happen, but you don't know how it's going to happen and the impact on the contract. Our experience of PPAs is that it's very hard to negotiate a position on that. I've seen people get away with it once or twice, but in the time when energy prices were really, really high and people were just trying to do a deal. So some generators got away with the situation to say, oh, if REMA comes in and it messes around with this PPA, then we just want a unilateral right to terminate. And there's a desperate buyer going to say, whatever, we just need to sign the PPA quickly before prices go up anymore. So it was that sort of situation. It's very, very, very difficult to deal with change in law and give it any certainty. And if you get to a position where you are agreeing to unravel, essentially to terminate the contract, on the buyer side, you say, well, we just want to be able to terminate the contract if there's a change in law that we don't like. That's not going to be a bankable PPA. So you need to understand the position from both sides. Liability caps, absolutely essential. No one likes uncapped risk. Quite complicated, can be quite complicated, hugely boring. I find them incredibly boring. I think this is part of the reason that those three things, or the last two things coming together, are one of the reasons that they get left to the end all the time. I sometimes play a little game and say, it'll be the last thing we agree with the liability caps, and it often is. There are options over structure, single aggregate caps, annual aggregate caps, often a cap on termination liabilities. That's the big risk on a fixed price or fixed index PPA, is mark-to-market exposure on an early termination. So you need to cover that off. You need to make sure you've got that cap sized properly at a level that you're happy with. And then, of course, you throw into a conversation of, well, I've capped my termination liabilities here. What's my credit support requirement? What's the credit support amount? So there's lots of things to consider there. Availability and performance guarantees. What is the seller promising that it will deliver? And what is the buyer expecting? What comfort does the buyer need? The last point is the most important, to my mind. It's what comfort, what assurance a buyer needs. Because no generator wants to give availability guarantees. It's only if they're pushed. Some buyers are really, will take a risk. They'll say, actually, for a low price, we won't have any availability guarantees, and we will just rely on the commercial reality that generators want to make power and want to make money from power. So they're going to want to generate as much as possible. But there's a nervousness in any procurement team. You don't want to be the one that signed up to a PPA that doesn't have any availability guarantees, just in case the availability is really poor. So there's very much an individual personal reaction to that. So we find situations where, more often than not, you have occasionally overly complicated measurements of availability with consequences which are LDs and termination at certain levels. And what that can do is just bump the price up. So again, you're not getting availability guarantees for nothing. And then the last one's delay. Greenfield projects only, really, for delay. Is the seller guaranteeing to supply from a certain date? If so, what if there is a delay? Normally it's LDs, daily LDs. And a termination if it's really prolonged past a certain date. So what you need to be thinking at that point is, how much delay is too much? How much delay is not okay? And I've rhymed accidentally. Force majeure and excusing causes are the really big issue. In what circumstances is it not their fault? How do we say, well, there was availability there, but it was a grid issue or something else? It's not down to us. So all of these issues here talk to deliverability, talk to bankability, talk to price. They're not tick box exercises. Even if we had a standardized form of contract, you couldn't go down each one of these and just go, yeah, I want that one, I'll have one of those and two of those and a couple of those and one of those over there. It doesn't really work like that, and it'll spit out a price and a risk profile. It doesn't really work like that. It might do in the future, you never know with AI. But at the moment, they all need proper human consideration. But with an efficient process, which Grace is going to talk all about later, and with expert advice, of course, and experience, the process can be streamlined significantly, and even for the really chunky sleeved and virtual PPAs. That is me.